Probably my favourite comic I've read this past year was Lucie Bryon's Thieves, a kind of rom-com that focuses on these two characters here, Ella and Madeline. The comic has a ton of interesting things in it to discuss, but there's one sequence near the beginning that I think is just a brilliant one to examine at all levels of the craft, from the writing, the art, the lettering. All of it combines to create this perfect whole of a singular moment where Ella catches eyes with her crush, Madeline. So in this episode, I want to examine that sequence, see what we can learn from it, and understand why it utilises the comics medium so effectively. You're watching Strip Panel Naked, I'm Hass, and I'm going to show you some of the cool stuff lurking in the pages of some of the best comics. I'll give you a glimpse of these 4 pages I want you to look at, just to get a sense of how it plays out in sequence. Ella turns up to class, sees Madeline, and then gets snapped back to reality by her friend Leslie. Very simple. So why do I love it so much? Okay, well, first, let's just quickly break down the role of this scene, the point of it. There's very little exposition, the whole aim of it seems to just be to establish this crush that Ella has, and essentially how it seems to be somewhat one-sided, or at least as far as we can tell so far. It's a cool sequence even from this bird's eye view of looking at all 4 pages, with this clever visual metaphor of the wave crashing. But if we look at each page, there's a few specific things I want to look at that pull in all facets of comic making to get a particular concept across. So for example, the first tier of the first page here is a 3-panel sequence that establishes that something is different about today. 2 panels establish normality, before Leslie here points out that Ella would never miss Thursday morning's lecture. Here, Lucie Bryon changes the style, the soft peach is switched this black, the framing crops off the characters and condenses the imagery, which suddenly makes the moment so much more conspiratorial, right? It's like we, the reader, have just leaned in to hear this conversation, and that in itself makes the dialogue feel a little bit quieter too. Like this immediately already feels like a whispered moment removed from everything else around the 2 characters. Because that's literally how it's drawn, that's exactly how Lucie Bryon has framed this entire moment. They're removed from the world, and we suddenly go from this mid-wide framing to this incredibly close moment where we're so close to them that we can see the sweat on Ella's face. And the lettering changes too, to this sort of fluffier looking balloon. Again, to me it reads more like a whispered, more airy sound. I'm a big fan of this because it's so immediate in its presentation as a whole panel. Even when you look at the whole page removed in this kind of wider look, that black space stands out as being really different to everything else around it. It's once again taking an established approach and then suddenly changing it to create a specific reader response. The bottom sequence of this same page is also worth looking at. It's 4 panels of almost the same dimensions. First, it's Ella face on looking at Madeline, who then we see in the second panel with her back turned. When we go back to Ella, she's almost falling off the panel, almost falling off the page, and we're right up close to her eyes. The final panel is Madeline turning, fading out by the edge, but completely filling up the panel. This is just storytelling fundamentals 101, right? Because individually these images are composed to already say something. Like in this panel in isolation, it's already speaking to you, it already has like a slight mystery, this faded image, the almost gasp open mouth that Madeline has. Similarly with Ella on the previous panel, it's like she's hiding, right? As though the panel edge is almost at the bottom of the table she's sat behind, and she's just kind of peering over the edge of it to see. And when you put them together, the difference in presentation then becomes even more obvious, and this is essentially just what comics does, this is how comics work. Suddenly Ella falling out of the panel and Madeline's soft reveal work together to create this larger idea of Ella's almost emotional fear of the reality of Madeline, like she can't even stand to look at her, she's so beautiful. That works because each image individually is already telling a story, right? It already has a narrative in the way it is drawn and composed. But then when you put them together, that juxtaposition, that contrast of the 2 images then takes us further to say something even more interesting. The next page is pretty self-explanatory, but it is worth noting how the image is so much larger than anything else we see in the majority of the rest of the comic, honestly. Big, it has no panel border, it's an uncontainable moment of absolute pure rushing emotion as the tidal wave arrives and sweeps up Ella. This is a very comics thing to do, right, where the world can change from one panel to the next, from one page to the next, becoming this visual metaphor for a moment before returning to reality on the next page. And why not, right? The beauty of the medium is that it's very unreal, that there is an artifice presented in every moment. How one panel can jump to become literally anything else in the next, and this is a great example of utilizing that idea. It's just fun too, right? That when Madeline turns around in the first panel of the next page, the tidal wave has crashed down and Ella is kind of floating back down to earth. She's still sweating in the next panel, or maybe it's just water from the tidal wave that hit her, who knows. And then the next sequence is just the lecture passing. And here Bryon gives us another little comics lesson about the value of gutters in understanding passing time. In every other moment, the gutters have been large and clear. A distinct moment of time is taking place between the images, essentially, allowing that sense of some lingering time to happen and pass. Here, Bryon creates a montage instead by having the images kind of smash against each other without clear borders, just black ink lines. The speed of the scene is so much quicker, including the lack of dialogue in the sequence as well, which means the moment is just read faster, which means it exists so much quicker both for the reader and in turn our understanding of how that time feels for the people contained within it. Ella is lost in this sequence, where each individual image seems to be less significant than the overall whole. So I read this to be, if we consider a normal panel with space and gutter around it to be a single image, it's as though this whole chunk of panels is that one image. We aren't reading these individually so much as seeing all of these as part of the same big panel. And that idea is just so interesting, right? It's fundamentally a huge shift in the understanding and reading. And knowing that you have the ability to do something like that is a massive tool in making comics. And all by dropping out the panel borders, suddenly you turn a ton of different images essentially into one panel, essentially into one image, just made up of all these different fragments. And that completely changes the way that you can think about how to utilize a panel within a page of comics. That's pretty crazy to me in this really fascinating way, how such a small difference can lead to a major change in the way that we engage with the imagery and understand it. And then it's broken by a page turn, which literally snaps our engagement, and also by Leslie literally grabbing Ella and saying stop it. Brilliant, right? The story of the panel is mimicking the way the comic is being read. The rest of the page goes back to the established regular storytelling. But there's also a fun touch that happens in the bottom row when Ella complains about how fast the lecture has gone, which is a nice throwback to that montage sequence we were just talking about, how the colliding panels have made the time go by so much faster. The lettering is evocative, the tail is actually just a drip forming in the shape of a tear, like the one Ella has on her face, before Leslie's balloon in the next panel goes back to sort of normal. And it's yet another example of how the formal elements of comics, so balloons, panels, gutters, colours, can be used to be evocative tools rather than just sort of formal, basic ones. And this whole sequence and this episode really is an example of how comics can be a loud art form. Much like theatre, which is larger and louder than film in a sense, and yet it can still be plenty subtle and small at the same time. And this, for me, is the space in which comics thrive. They are big and loud in one way to draw to the subtlety shown around it. Gutters don't need to just be gutters, right? They can be tools to tell the story, to shape time around moments in interesting ways, to further our understanding of characters and their relationships. Balloons don't need to just be standard spherical balloons. They can drip, they can reshape themselves to showcase breathiness or anxiety or fear or mimicry. Lucie Bryon's Thieves has examples of this in abundance, and it's a really good comic to check out if you want to see a creator not afraid to use all these different tools to their advantage in a very approachable story that might make you think a little differently about some of the ways that we approach telling stories in comics. Thanks for watching. I want to quickly mention that a comic I wrote called The Unlikely Story of Felix and Macabre is out at the end of October 2023, published by Dark Horse Comics. It's co-created and drawn by the incredible Junibar, and it's a full graphic novel about a young monster called Felix, who meets a sort of grizzled old veteran monster fighting champion called Macabre, and they go on a journey through giant dog monsters and saliva knights and arch nemeses to discover if, punching your problems until they go away is a healthy way to get through your life. You can pre-order it now from anywhere, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Waterstones in the UK. Any bookshop or comic book shop will also order it for you if you ask them. We're very proud of it and I hope you'll like it too. Otherwise, check out the 2-time Eisner-winning magazine I created and co-edited called Panel by Panel. There's a deep dive interviews and great craft discussions with just tons and tons and tons of brilliant creators like Tom King, Cliff Chang, Matt Fraction, Kelly Sue DeConnick and way, way, way more. And I'll be back soon with more new episodes. And catch you next time.